Hey everybody, welcome back to the Acts Challenge. How many of you love a good story? Do you have any family legends that are told by your grandfather, maybe your great-grandmother, something that's told over and over and over again every single time your family gets together? And maybe do you have instances where the retelling of that story is something people both roll their eyes out and love to hear? It's maybe dramatized a little bit each time it's told, something that no one really seems to notice because the core elements of the story are there. Sometimes those stories are so ingrained in us that they become a part of who we are. They become a part of who our family is. And it's like in order to prove that we belong to that family, we need to know, we need to embody, we need to have the passion behind the retelling of that story. So think about telling an important, impassioned story as you read Acts 22. Now, setting the stage a little bit for you, Paul is about to be imprisoned here in this chapter, and he's begging the authorities to let him have one more word, to let him speak to the people who are gathered. He tells them that he is a Jew from Tarsus, and then he addresses the people in their own language. He uses their language possibly to break down the stereotype that he is just simply another prisoner who's done something wrong, some kind of criminal. And then Paul takes this time to tell his conversion story. Now, we first heard about this story back in Acts chapter 9, and that's the story of Paul, who was then known as Saul, who was a Pharisee who persecuted people. He stood by while Stephen was stoned to death. And in chapter 22, Paul retells the people here of this entire experience. He talks about walking down the road to Damascus when suddenly he's blinded by a light that shines down, and then he hears the voice of Jesus saying, Saul, why do you persecute me? And then Paul tells us that he is taken by a man named Ananias to the city, and Ananias says to him, Paul, you are actually going to be the one who goes out to tell people about Jesus. We hear that Jesus changed Paul's life. And it's important for us to notice at this point, while Paul is facing imprisonment, that he could have approached things in a different way. He could have looked at his Jewish heritage and the laws that he knew. He could have reasoned his way out of imprisonment, tried to persuade the authorities of what he knew or what kind of reputable citizen he was. But instead, Paul defaults by telling a story. And if you look back in your Bibles to chapter 9, you'll notice, if you look at all the details, that the story is a little different. And we don't necessarily know why that is, but we could assume that it's because Paul was so passionate as he told this story. Just think about it. He had traveled all over the place with some of Jesus's disciples, adding more people, losing some to terrible deaths, telling people, teaching people along the way, all because of the way Jesus changed his life. Now, you might say that Paul was passionately telling his faith story or his calling in the world as he went on these journeys. And the phrase calling is something we throw around in the church a lot. It's not like we say, okay, here is your job as a Christian. You must accomplish X, Y, and Z in order to lead to this result. Calling speaks to it a little more broadly. Some people might call it a vocation. The dictionary actually defines vocation as a summons or strong inclination to a particular state or course of action. It's more than an understanding that if we do these things as a Christian, it will mean something down the road. The course of action in vocation seems to tell us that there's constant movement or discovery in our Christian journey. And as Paul himself would tell us, this story of faith doesn't necessarily come without trials, without troubles. There might be pain and suffering. But how can we passionately tell the story of our faith again and again and again for everyone to hear, no matter where we are? So here are some questions I invite you to think about today as you're reading Acts chapter 22. What is important to your faith story? Think about the details. It may not be a story that involves blinding light and falling down on the road and hearing voices, but what is important to your faith story? And secondly, how can the church be open to hearing the faith stories of others? If we don't ask, we'll never learn. So let's normalize asking one another about our faith stories. Thanks so much.